But when, as the British Conservative Party has been for the past, 70 years now, I'd say, when your opponents are dogmatic, there are two things you can do. One is you can adopt their dogma and do what they do. The other is you can develop an intellectual challenge to it and, when necessary, combat it and even reverse it. And that's what the Tories in this country simply did not do. What Marx really was a man who wanted to take part in the French Revolution, particularly the bits after about 1792. The anti-Christian bits, the socially revolutionary bits. The economic stuff was added later and I think has now been taken away. We're back to the Jacobins. Israel exists because of the hatred for Jews in Europe in the 1930s. That's why it's here.
My guest, not for the first time, is someone I count a good friend and a wonderful observer of life in general and politics and public life in particular, Peter Hitchens. He writes extensively for the press in the UK. He's been a war correspondent. He's reported from Moscow towards the end of the USSR's time as a communist country. Peter's written many books, the latest being A Revolution Betrayed: How Egalitarianism Wrecked the British Education System. He's a very sought-after commentator in Britain and beyond. Peter, it's terrific to see you again and to be able to discuss, hot off the press, if we can put it that way, the extraordinary election that's just produced a new government in Great Britain.
Yes, it is extraordinary.
Well, you have been very critical, and you're not alone, of the Conservatives in this country for a long time. This looks to me as though the British people agreed with you. They'd lost their way. As much as anything else, it appeared they voted them out as much as they voted the new team in.
I think there was a lot of that. But of course, the problem with doing that is that if you vote somebody out because you don't like what they're doing or what they've done, it makes sense to replace them with somebody who might be better. But in fact, they've voted them out and replaced them with something worse. And I was always taught to choose the lesser of two evils and to choose the bad in preference to the worse. And this country has just definitely chosen the worse in preference to the bad. It put me in a very awkward position. I did not want in any way to be able to look back on this and think that I had not done everything I could to avoid it, because this is the return in full strength of the Blair government of 1997. That's what Keir Starmer's government is. It's Blair Mark II, and I thought Blair Mark I did quite enough harm. And I did everything I could to prevent it, but as you see, totally failed, as usual.
It is important to note, isn't it, though, that it's hardly a thumping mandate. You had a very low voter turnout, and even amongst those who did vote, they're there with about a third of the votes.
Well, yes, we have quite low polls now here, but as I say, what they got was, I think, just under 34% of those who voted. But that's our system, and I can't really complain about it because it's a system I defend. I'm in favour of first past the post, as against the proportional representation, which everybody seems to fashionably prefer to it. And it's the way it works. This is the way democracies work. However it is your system goes, if in the United States it's the Electoral College, whatever it is, it's how it goes. I think in 1951, the Labour government was chucked out, though it got more votes than the Tories in the second 51 election. But the rules said if you win a majority in Parliament, then you win the election. I have to stick by the rules. So yeah, it's not terribly prepossessing, but it's happened. And I don't think anyone can really seriously argue that because it was a low poll and a poor turnout that it's not a legitimate government, because it is. I'm very much in favour of losers' consent. I think it's the whole basis of democratic government hangs together only if losers consent to the fact that the other side have won. You have to do it, however much it sticks in your throat.
It is the age, as Lord Assumption puts it, of disengagement. a great deal of cynicism out there, a great reluctance to get involved in politics, probably pretty powerful disincentives for people of goodwill and good intent to be involved in politics, whether it's at grassroots branch membership, whether it's at the organisational side, or whether it's actual public representation. How much of a problem do you think that is for Britain and the West more generally?
That's a colossal problem. And Vance Packard foresaw it when I think he did the first revised edition of his great book on advertising, The Hidden Persuaders, back in the 50s, when he warned that advertising had poisoned so much of public discourse, and once it was applied to politics, it would do enormous damage to politics. It duly has. It's one of the whole of the history of the past 50 years is covered in ignored signposts and warnings, and that was one of them. People said, "Oh, well, that's very interesting, Mr. Packard, thank you very much," and they didn't pay any attention. And so public relations, which is basically propaganda, and advertising has come into politics and created as a sort of branch of show business in which almost no rational, sensible human these days wishes to get involved, because it destroys the lives of those who get involved with it for very little reward, it seems to me, and also for very little effect on public life. If you are one of those people who thought, as I think many of us have thought at some point in our lives, well, I could go into politics and make a difference. You look at it now and you think that if you went into politics, it would make a difference to you. That is to say, it would ruin your personal life and leave you at the end destroyed. And Enoch Powell used to joke that all political careers end in failure. And I suppose it's true, but it's much more true now than it was when he said it.
So at precisely the time when we both need and I think want good, strong, focused leadership, given the challenges we face, we've actually disincentivised the people who might be able to provide it.
I think so.
It's
I think
an
awful lot of the people who would once have thought it would be worth doing don't do so anymore. All kinds of other things have happened in this country. For instance, we destroyed local government by foolish reforms, which was a great nursery of political skill, and it's almost entirely gone. The trade unions, which on the Labour side were immensely important as a nursery of political acumen, have been turned into lobby groups. They don't have, and the other thing, they no longer draw on this amazing thing which the trade unions did. They provided a kind of university for the poor, which brought people of the caliber of, say, Ernest Bevin out from the most extraordinary, wretched beginnings to be able to be great statesmen. That's gone. And then this thing, the subject of my most recent book, in this country we had an education system which didn't always, but it was capable of taking someone, again, from a very poor home and giving him or her a superb education and putting them through the best universities and bringing into the elite the best people in the country. And at the same time, keeping the standards of all the education in the country high. And that's gone. So we've lost all these things at the time when we need them most. And you see it all the time in levels of competence, in the willingness of people to do crucial things in politics. One of the most vital things in politics is to be able to stand against the mob. I think Pericles was once applauded in Athens, and he turned to whoever was standing beside him and said, "Have I just said something incredibly stupid?" The need to be people in politics who don't want applause and who have a willingness to stand against the crowd. And again, the poor education leads to conformity, and also the dominance first of television and then of the internet in creating a unified public attitude towards everything from humour to opinion has made people far less willing to be individuals or to show courage in moments of difficulty. So it's hard to see how anybody could, in modern politics, get anywhere. Very quickly it would swallow them up.
Quite a bit of commentary in Australia that England is doing the opposite of the continent. The continent is moving to the right. Some people are calling it a populist movement. I think Neil Ferguson thinks that's overstated. But here in Britain, you've had the opposite. You've had a swing to the left. But to what extent are both movements actually protest movements? I have to say, I think the events on the European continent are overrated.
I think there is a certain very interesting and growing resentment against green, particularly net zero orthodoxy, because of the very harsh effects it's having both on employment and, interestingly, on agriculture in some of the continental countries. And there's obviously a growing worry about whether the European continent has entirely lost control of its borders, which tends to favour what you might call conservative or nationalist parties anyway. But as we've seen in France over the weekend, and as I think when you look at the real situation in the Netherlands, for instance, where we're practically told that Geert Wilders has become the undisputed leader of the country. In fact, I think his party has many fewer than a majority of seats in the Netherlands Parliament, and has to coalesce with other parties to make any progress at all. I think Giorgia Meloni in Italy is not really particularly, despite the background of her party, particularly of the political right. I think it's overrated. I think Neil Ferguson is right to be cautious about it. What's happening here, again, there has been a sort of, our great popular leader is Nigel Farage, who's not to be compared with any of the people on the continent. He's very much an English, even, rather than a British figure, very specific to this country, and not completely unlike any of these continental figures, and a good thing too. And he has a certain following, but I'm not sure whether it's going to break out from the area of that particular part of England for which he undoubtedly speaks and become anything bigger. We still have a Labour government with a very big majority holding an awful lot of seats in Parliament, whereas his party holds 5.
You touched then on this being, Blair Martu. Can you give us a feel, because you've understood and commented extensively on Sir Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, over a long period of time. You understand him quite well, his motivations.
I wouldn't make a claim to understand him. I think I have some knowledge of him which might give me a sort of clue as to the kind of man that he is. It's very readily available knowledge. It's not secret, but nobody's terribly interested in it. New Labour came out of a strand of politics called Eurocommunism, which was the complete revision of the left in Europe after 1968. And 2 things happened, colossal things happened in 1968, which I remember very clearly. The first was the May events in Paris, which were actually a sort of the politicization of sex and drugs and rock and roll, the beginning of Cultural Revolution. Fundamentally, the origins of the 68 events in Paris were actually about sex, about male access to female dormitories at the Nanterre branch of the University of Paris, believe it or not. It was wordless in a way. You heard the shouts and you saw the cobblestones flying and the clever little slogans and the posters, but it was almost unstated what it was about. But it was a cultural revolution. And then later in that same year, the much grimmer, much more ferocious, much more significant to me, rolling of the Warsaw Pact tanks into Prague and the crushing of a very rather naive, extremely modest attempt by Alexander Dubček to alter Soviet-style communism into something more intelligent. And that was the thing which made many people on the left in Europe, who had previously been sympathetic or at least defensive towards Moscow, revolt. It was what Dubček was doing was intelligent, or appeared to be intelligent, and they sent tanks in to crush intelligence. And the left began to think, we can't go on with this, and that was the death, really, of the old Soviet communism, of the old belief in nationalizing everything, and the old belief of the total Soviet state. And the left began to look for other solutions. And that current found its way into Britain, oddly enough, through the theoretical magazine of Blairism in the 90s, was a magazine called Marxism Today, which was actually an official journal of the British Communist Party. But it was so Euro-communist in terms of being, say, culturally and morally left, that it didn't look like a communist magazine at all. And then this was also the moment at which my generation, the 60s, early 70s student generation, who'd been on our long march through the institutions ever since really 68, were beginning to rise to positions of prominence in the professions we'd adopted. So the whole country was ready for a government with much, much more left-wing instincts, but not the instincts of the old Soviet Union, of the ghastly men in suits and trilby hats who stood on Lenin's tomb, but the instincts of anti-colonialism, the instincts of sexual revolution, the instincts of moral revolution, the things which would become the Green Movement. These were the things which came to power in Britain in 1997. And I think Keir Starmer comes very much from that tradition.
Thus, your remarks recently that if you don't have any understanding of Marxism, Leninism, you're completely lost in trying to understand modern European politics.
I think so. I think somebody who doesn't either remember that astonishing year of 1968 or doesn't grasp the huge earthquake in thinking which it led to, is at sea in trying to work out. People still think that revolutionaries are men in dirty clothes with bad manners standing on tops of heaps of rubble waving cutlasses. They're not. They're men in nice suits with intelligent arguments and smooth voices, making the case for whatever it happens to be in terms of dismantling the former conservative Christian morals of Europe, which of course was what the real progenitor of all this, the great Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci, believed in. Yeah. One of the cleverest men who ever lived, and he went to the Soviet Union in the 1920s. He said, "This will never work. The working class of Western Europe will never buy this. It's outrageous. We need to have it."
Really in Russia. I mean,
no, but they had no choice, because if they didn't buy it, they got killed. Yeah. So,
but it wasn't really
they didn't have that
revolution.
But no, what Gramsci saw was that revolution didn't have to be like that. You could still have a revolution. The socialist utopia, which he still ultimately believed in, could, in his view, still be created, but not like that. And it's his spirit that now walks broad.
So the irony of France and kids overturning vehicles and setting them alight and riding in the streets because they wanted a different approach to, if you like, men wanting access to girls. So they were luxury beliefs. They were the bourgeoisie themselves. They were the people who actually...
Well, they were, but they fell into step with and became identified with the other side of it. The side of it which said the old idea of rigid control of the economy, of nationalisation of everything down to ice cream stands, was a nonsense. Well, that was revised as well. And also the whole approach to obtaining political power was not the old ridiculous Leninist idea of the vanguard party, which is basically an Edwardian concept, tossed in the bin. In fact, the whole idea of the party as it was tossed in the bin, but on the other hand, still a belief in transforming society.
To what? And that comes back to the question of what sort of government will this be? If it's been shaped by these influences, if so many of the people in that movement can tell you what they're against, what are they actually in favour of? Where will they go? What will this look like? Assuming they win a second term, will they be more left-wing and doctrinaire, ideologically driven in their second term? Will they seek to be very moderate during the first? I don't want to put words in your mouth. What will they look like?
I think any government...
Your record of predicting these things is pretty good.
No, you're testing. No, but any government with radical intentions will try to be careful in its first term and save its biggest events for the second. I mean, the major redistribution of the Blair government came in the second term. The Equality Act, which was the great social and moral revolutionary action of the Blair government, wasn't actually passed till 2010, just before they left office. So a lot of the stuff was kept till later. And indeed, the major constitutional change, the creation of the Supreme Court and the Judicial Appointments Commission, which totally revolutionized the judiciary and the way in which the law operates, were late flowering things. So we can probably expect that this time. There is also a major constitutional plan, which Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, and Keir Starmer jointly launched actually in 2022, which is fascinating and complex, but which would make a lot of the constitutional changes up till now irreversible and actually suck an enormous amount of power out of the House of Commons permanently. And these are there, but they're very faintly mentioned in the Labour manifesto for this last election. So they may again be a second-term project with other things between now and then. I can't tell that. They wouldn't tell me. On the other hand, of course, remember that some of the really big things which the Blair government did, abandoning control over interest rates by giving independence to the Bank of England, and a gigantic raid on private pension funds, crippling for many people, and one of the worst actions of the Blair government, and the extraordinary deneutralisation of the civil service by appointing Alistair Campbell, particularly in Jonathan Powell, to give orders to civil servants, although they weren't responsible to either House of Parliament. These really big things were not announced by the Blair government in their manifesto and came as great shocks in the weeks immediately afterwards to most people when they happened. So we don't know. They've only just got their knees under the table. I'm prepared for any number of surprises. They don't have to tell you what they're going to do.
Presumably they'll be greatly constrained by anemic economic growth, by very difficult global circumstances, by the very high level of public sector indebtedness in Great Britain. It's very hard to go on spending money if the markets lose confidence, for example. The bond market becomes shaky. They may very well have the last say. They've got big spending commitments out there.
Rachel Reeves' job.
And they've got great demand in this country for a lot of what might be called butter.
Yeah, but the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, her job is to try and keep the bond markets calm. Also, there are areas where they can, in the medium term, I think, raise quite a lot of money, and through some sort of wealth tax. My own guess is that they will probably weaponize local property taxes, what we call council tax here, which has been left untouched by governments for a very long time. It's based on ancient valuations of houses and could be greatly increased as a reservoir of money from which the government could draw. They didn't rule it out by any means in the election campaign. And one of the few interesting moments, journalistically interesting moments of the election campaign, was when Keir Starmer was asked by Nick Ferrari on a radio interview, because he kept saying during the campaign that he wasn't going to tax working people. So Nick asked him, well, who do you mean by working people? And to summarize what he said people without savings. As you and I will agree, an awful lot of working people do have savings. And therefore that means that anybody with savings seems to me to be under some sort of threat of coming under quite heavy extra taxation from this government at some point. There are ways of raising money, and of course they can borrow if they're subtle about it. Though I agree with you, the levels of borrowing, the levels of spending, the enormous numbers of people being paid to do nothing are astonishing, and the general economic statistics of this country are deeply dispiriting, but that won't necessarily stop them.
No, I'm sure that's right. I can't help asking this. We're witnessing in America an extraordinary situation. A lot of commentary about the current president's apparent mental decline. And it emerges that, in fact, one of the major influences in his life, somebody who wields a massive amount of power, is his spouse. What do we know about the sort of influences of people around him, of the new Prime Minister?
Oh, well, I think that a lot of people around Keir Starmer are actually the former Blairites. You know, Blair himself emerged to offer advice the other day, and I'm sure that Keir Starmer is in frequent contact with him. Gordon Brown is very much in the background. As I say, they cooperated over these constitutional changes. Gordon Brown is a very politically active man who no longer seeks office, but I'm sure seeks influence. Alistair Campbell is still around, the great spin doctor of the Blair years, and people such as Alan Milburn have been brought back out of, well, it's not even retirement, brought back into direct politics, and I think more will be. It's very easy in this country to put someone into the House of Lords, And they've made it clear very early on that they were quite prepared to create a fair number of new members of the House of Lords if it suited them. And I think there were quite a lot of major Blairite figures from the past will, I think, emerge from there as advisors, as heads of Quango bodies, or just as people known to be in touch. I think Keir Starmer will rely very heavily on them. It's quite interesting that this recruitment of veterans of the 1997 to 2010 government includes both Blairites, Brownites, who at the time were often bitterly divided. Yes. But I think he's brought them together. I think they recognise that was a serious mistake, and that they need to work together to keep him in power. And this is certainly not a man who will be any kind of fool. He's certainly not a fool, and he's certainly a highly competent and directed person. The American comparison you make always reminds me of a criticism I've often made. The Americans, when they threw off King George III, created instead an elected monarchy, which was in fact, in many ways, more autocratic than the monarchy they'd thrown off. And of course, given that it now has the legitimacy of democracy, is immensely powerful and very, very hard to get rid of if people don't like it. So here we have a very big constitutional problem in the United States. It is indeed the case that the president's wife can have immense influence over an event of this kind. I think something similar happened during the declining years of Woodrow Wilson. And nobody knows what to do. And it seems to me to be a strong argument in favour of the British parliamentary system, where you draw your authority from a parliamentary majority and not from a popular election.
I agree with that. The other thing it does is an interesting bynote. It forces leaders in your system and in the Australian one to learn to articulate a case. They have to make it on the floor of a parliament. They've got to be able to put together an argument and prosecute it.
Yes.
And I think that's very important.
Yeah, a White House press conference just won't do it.
No.
It simply doesn't put the same strain on. There's also the simple fact that they can get rid of you. I think after the Bay of Pigs, JFK said, well, if I were the British Prime Minister, I'd have to resign. Looking at his table full of aides and advisors, as it is, you'll have to resign.
Tell me, international relations, we've seen a very quick move by the current government to do what they can to draw closer to Europe. Then there's big questions. They look very supportive of Ukraine and are already committing to further assistance for Ukraine. There's the question of the Middle East. Where will they go in terms of foreign policy? Well, perhaps I should preface that by saying I'm intrigued that right up front they've said they will increase expenditure on defence.
Yes. Well, there's many ways of doing that, and you just include more things in the defence budget, which he was spending already, is the best way of doing it, and try it and test it. I think you'll find in these events. We'll see whether they actually do. Our national defence is in such a mess that it would be very difficult to know how you could spend money effectively to make it any better. And as I say, accounting is often the best way of doing it. British foreign policy is basically stick as close to the United States of America as you possibly can.
And that'll continue?
Well, that's easy when you've got a normal administration in Washington, D.C. But it becomes more complicated if you have an abnormal administration in Washington, D.C. I mean, how do you stick close to them when you don't even know what they're going to do tonight, let alone tomorrow? So it's going to be harder. But every decision that's taken is basically, let's do what the Americans are doing more enthusiastically. So there hasn't been. I mean, my own view for a long time has been that we should take a much more goalist position and tell the Americans that we're not necessarily going to do what they're going to do or agree with them about everything, because actually you get treated better if you do that. I wouldn't want an ally which was so ready to toady to me as the British government is under both parties to the United States government. I just wouldn't want one. I'd want an ally that stood up to me. It would be more use. It's just like you don't want pushovers. Anybody who's running an office or any kind of enterprise or a government department, they don't want to be surrounded by pushovers. They need people who will stand up to them. It's vital for any purpose of leadership or government or activity to have people who will. You don't want yes men, but this is the function of the British government towards the United States.
It would be a great tragedy if Britain's role at the sort of head table of nations was diminished or weakened, in my view.
Do you think? I don't know. I think this country. I'm very selfish about this. I think this country would be a lot happier if we stopped having these delusions of grandeur. And recognise that we are actually an extremely fortunate country in a wonderful geographical situation with tremendous agricultural and natural resources and an enormous wealth in culture and history and institutions. But trying to live vastly beyond our means and to be far more important than we are, I think it causes
I accept that.
endless grief. And we would be so much better if we said, okay, those days were wonderful, but they've gone. You can't carry on. What's the point of being, of maintaining a vast strategic Cold War nuclear deterrent when you have towns and cities in the north of England which are a national disgrace?
I don't think I'm actually denying that so much as saying that the experience, the perspectives, the expertise in foreign affairs, that
such as it was.
Well, that's the point.
Well, it doesn't seem to me that particularly since the Iraq debacle, this has counted very much.
I take your point, but my point is
France did better on that.
That is being lost.
A lot of people say a lot of bad things about Jacques Chirac, but he was right on Iraq, and Blair was wrong.
Well, of course, Australia was part of the coalition, so to
speak.
Yeah,
but it didn't. You weren't quite as deep into it as we were, I think.
I think it's the experience and the wisdom and the perspectives and the commitment to democracy and so forth that this country's been known for that will be a real loss to the world if Britain becomes totally inward-looking and loses what you've just referenced.
Well, not totally inward-looking, but there's a question of whether you're outward-looking. I think we should look. We should be more knowledgeable about our continental neighbours than we often are, and indeed more knowledgeable about the United States, and understand that this delusion that we have a special relationship with them is that thing. I hunted when I lived in Washington D.C. I hunted for some months for the special relationship. I could not find it because nobody knew what it was. It is not there. It does not exist. But it's a kind of fetish that British politicians and people should know more about the outside world. I'm very fortunate. I do. And I see it, I think, and it brings me back here thinking not how superior we are to other countries, but how much we could learn from them, and how much say, of a more genuinely prosperous, genuinely influential, and happier policy we could be if we paid more attention to the outside world. Not of the kind of saying, we are Britain, we used to be the greatest empire in the world, and we used to have a navy, so you must listen to us. But actually, we're Britain, we're the country which abolished the slave trade. We're the country which invented Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights, and the rule of law and jury trial, and we therefore have something useful to say to you all, but not necessarily by virtue of a supposed independent nuclear deterrent which plops into the sea and sinks when we try to use it.
I get where you're coming from. Tell me the issue of the Middle East, Israel, and the conflict there. A lot of commentary in this country about the increasing importance of the Muslim vote, uncertainty around how that might influence policies. Will it impact Britain's support in the first instance, for example, for Israel?
Well, a bit, but I think we'd like to go back to the conversation we had here in this very room some months ago, shortly after the initial outrage by Hamas, which was then followed by the Gaza retaliations of Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, what I said here then, and I got some criticism for it, was that Israel was making a grave mistake by responding in the way that it did, and it had been actually given an enormous the horrors of the pogrom, had put it in a position where it would be able to point to this and say to the world, look, this is where we now stand. Nobody has done these ghastly, disgusting things to us because we haven't negotiated a two-state solution, or because we haven't finished the Oslo Agreement, or because of the way that we treat Arab Israelis. They've done it because they hate us and they want to kill us. And this is the reason why the state exists in the first place, and we're not going to respond in kind. And I think one of the gravest mistakes made in modern history has been made by Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, by retaliating as they have done and by bombarding ceaselessly populated areas, which is almost invariably an indefensible action. I think Israel has almost certainly lost in the great nations of the great democratic nations of the world, lost an advantage it once had, a moral advantage and many other advantages, and I think it's in graver danger than it's ever been. Not military danger, but political and diplomatic danger. I think it was and continues to be a catastrophe, and I remain dismayed by the fact that so many on the supposed right have, who can not be appalled by Hamas and who can not be opposed to its aims and intentions, but have not found it, I won't say equally worrying, because it's not a question of equalities, but have not found it extraordinarily worrying that Israel has been making such a tremendous, disastrous diplomatic and political mistake for so long. I just want to remember that, because it's the bit of the conversation we had here last time that I most deeply remember, and one at the time for which I faced, as I so often do, quite a lot of severe criticism. I think what I said was right, and I still do.
I suppose the question I would come up with is where to for Israel, and what are the options really? Had they done nothing?
I'm not saying nothing, because I don't think nothing was possible. But I think that, as I say, opening a military attack upon the Gaza Strip, first of all, it was not going to release the hostages, and it hasn't. Secondly, it was not going to destroy Hamas, and it hasn't. Secondly, it was not going to strengthen Israel's position vis-à-vis either the Arab world or Iran, and it hasn't. Thirdly, it was going to do the most immense political and moral damage to the country. Doubtless there were inventive things which Israel could have done, though I think the power in the weeks immediately after the pogrom, the power of just saying, we are not like this. We do not respond in the way in which we were attacked. We do not kill civilians. We do not kill innocents. We're here because this country exists, Israel exists, because of the hatred for Jews in Europe in the 1930s. That's why it's here, because there was nowhere else to go, because for many people there was nowhere to go. That's why it's here. You've just seen a demonstration that is still as true as it was in 1945. And just to say that, to go before the United Nations, and we are not doing this. Okay, Israel has actually fantastic defenses against missile attack. It had a duty after that pogrom hugely to strengthen the basic border defenses between itself and Gaza. But you cannot. Have you been to Gaza? It's so dense. You cannot bombard it without the certainty that innocents will die.
Well, Hamas knows that too.
Of course, they know that. But in which of these policies would have done more harm to Hamas? I don't have any doubt.
I must say it's very distressing to me that many people now are prepared to gloss over the evil behaviour of Hamas and the way they.
Well, that's because it's been completely obscured by what's happened since in Gaza, and it barely gets mentioned now. Whereas if Netanyahu had not followed this policy, and again, there's another problem here for the Israeli left, who have for so many years, because this river of fire that runs between them and the Israeli right, have sought to exclude and Netanyahu from power and remove him from power and generally declared him as an enemy. I think probably up until recently unjustly. And as a result have pushed him, in my view, into the arms of some of the appalling people who now form his government. If they'd been more willing to recognise that he did represent a genuine strand of real opinion in Israel and to coalesce with him, then I don't think this would have happened. But they weren't, and I think this is a very important reflection in politics on how much damage it can sometimes do to refuse to talk to your opponents.
I think there's a real danger that Israel may simply not survive.
I think there's a real danger of that too. I think it has never been greater in my lifetime.
And I think that would be a terrible outcome.
Well, of course it would, yes, because the reason for its existence will remain.
Exactly.
And probably be greater.
Be greater, if anything. It's a terrible
And
situation.
it seems to me to be the pressing subject in foreign policy.
As our former Prime Minister Bob Hawke said, he's passed on now, but he made the observation that when the bell tolls for Israel, it tolls for all mankind.
Yeah.
And I think there's something to that.
There is something to it. I mean, look, we could sit here all afternoon, all evening discussing the history and the injustices and the wrongs. And anybody who takes a hardline, single-sided partisan view on the Israeli-Arab quarrel hasn't been properly briefed. Terrible wrongs have been done on both sides. And I long for some sort of modus vivendi to be established. But I don't think the standard response of Western diplomacy to this has been at all enlightened or sensible. And we said again last time as to the two-state solution has been demonstrated to be unworkable again by the pogrom.
Well, it's far less workable now than it ever was.
Nonetheless, this has been a grave failure. And again, a lot of the failure has come from the United States.
Back to the UK. What happens now for people on, if you like, the centre-right, conservatism? How do they rebuild? What are the ways?
Well, I reject the term centre, you see. I always push back against the use of it. Centre simply means, the person who's using the term centre means politics that I approve of. All kinds of amazing policies can become the centre if the right people win elections, or cease to be in the centre if the wrong people win elections, and it doesn't mean anything objective.
Well, Churchill alluded to that, I suppose, when he said he hadn't moved, his party had.
Well, there is no centre. In fact, there are many policies which I have some time for some policies of people on the left, and you have to the packages in which politics happens to have arranged itself aren't necessarily the only ways in which they could. I remain astonished, as I think I've said to you before, that there is no British Gaullist party which is in favour both of a strong welfare state and strong defence and borders and patriotism. No such party exists. But that in France was for many years the centre, because Charles de Gaulle made it the centre by sheer force of personality, and also because it was a good idea. But no such thing exists. In fact, such a formation in this country would be regarded as verging on extremist. So what do you say to that? So I don't use the word centre, because it doesn't guide you in any way. The Conservative Party it's not a conservative political formation. It calls itself a Conservative Party. It has always been an organisation for obtaining office for the sons of gentlemen. It doesn't really have any interest in politics. In fact, it used to pride itself on being uninterested in politics. We are a disposition, not a dogma, they used to say. And this works beautifully when your opponents don't have a dogma either. But when, as the British Conservative Party has been for the past, 70 years now, I'd say, when your opponents are dogmatic, there are two things you can do. One is you can adopt their dogma and do what they do. The other is you can develop an intellectual challenge to it and, when necessary, combat it and even reverse it. And that's what the Tories in this country simply did not do. And they particularly didn't do it. They didn't, to begin with, understand Blairism or how radical it was. And then when they did, they decided that it was always going to beat them and that they had better therefore adopt it. which is what David Cameron did in 2010. He adopted the outward forms of Blairism to be allowed back, because in this country, my theory is that the British Broadcasting Corporation operates as the medieval church used to. With its support, anybody can become a government. Without its support, they can't. The BBC had decided back in the Thatcher years that it wasn't going to put up with any more Tory governments, and it was outrageously biased against the Tories. And then in the declining years of Blairism, it began to see the possibility it might be necessary to support the Conservatives, and it was probably the major force by which they were browbeaten into becoming a party of the left. The problem with this was that while they adopted Blairist positions, and while they accepted the Blairist heritage, that's to say, they made it plain that when they came back into office, if they did, they wouldn't undo the Blair legacy. They didn't understand it. They didn't know why they were doing it. They didn't have any initiative at all. So they were neither one thing or the other. They were just an enormous, great wallowing vessel, dead in the water, without a running engine or a rudder, sitting there in government with no idea what to do about anything. And each crisis which came sweeping towards them like a wave, whether it be the European Union referendum or the COVID panic or whatever it was, they didn't really have any guiding spirit as to know how to respond to it. And they were constantly bowled over by these major events. And so they didn't, even if they wanted to develop a program, they couldn't have done anyway. And also it made for a very bad economic situation at the end of it. So there they were, left with nothing, and also so vulnerable, because they no longer had any real centre, so vulnerable to dashing tides of change that they actually ended up for a while with Elizabeth Truss as Prime Minister, an event which still, I have met Ms. Truss, still leaves me gasping that it could actually have happened, but it did. And in those events, they lost the election because people thought, well, how can we possibly entrust the country to these people anymore? So let's entrust it to somebody even worse, which is what they've now done. This is sort of Beatrix Potter version of recent British politics, as told by Mrs. Tiggy Winkle to Jemima Puddle Duck.
I first came to Britain in 1980 as a 23-year-old. Thatcher had just come to power.
Yeah.
Every night on the television, I think I might have mentioned this, there was a map of Great Britain, X number of jobs lost.
Oh yeah, I remember that. The red map for the jobs lost.
People of my age, I was an Australian, we were optimistic about our future in Australia. Yeah. Everything looked like, we'd have interesting lives. Here they were, depressed about opportunities at home, convinced there'd be a nuclear meltdown somewhere.
Well, there's still a Cold War going on in those days. It made a big difference to politics.
Thatcher, by dint of her personality, I would have thought, had a major impact on the country. How do you see her legacy now, looking back?
Oh, well, and you have, it's almost like one of those stories I used to read in the Children's Encyclopedia by the fire when I was small, the grocer's daughter who became Prime Minister and impressed the world. As a personal story, it's tremendously impressive. And I did meet her on more than one occasion, and she was a startling, if extremely bossy personality. But the end of it, examined, doesn't seem to me to add up to all that very much. I think the principal, I won't say achievement, but the principal thing which happened during her premiership was the deindustrialization of the country. The thing you watched on television night after night after night. This factory closes, that factory closes, this factory is closing. We ceased to be a major manufacturing country, in my view, in that period, and became something else. I'm not even sure she meant to do it. It's not clear, it depends which biography you read, whether she meant to do it or not. And then there was the Falklands, in which actually the sad truth is that she, by inept diplomacy, she got us into the mess where the Argentines thought they could seize the Falklands, and then she was rescued from it by my favourite institution in the world, the Royal Navy, who did their absolute utmost to take them back. and was still just in a condition to do so. If the Argentines had waited another couple of years, she'd have sold off or scrapped the ships which were used to retake the Falklands. So it's not as good as it looks, it seems to me. I think, as with Ronald Reagan in America, enormously overrated by conservatives. She wasn't really a conservative. She was ultimately an economic liberal. She expressed some conservative sentiments, and she was undoubtedly deeply patriotic and very traditional in some ways. But the society she left behind her when she left office was actually a lot less conservative than the one that she took over when she became Prime Minister. And I challenge people to name a single conservative policy using the small c, which she actually put through.
I would have thought one might have been that the public finances were in better condition.
Well, that's not particularly conservative, that's just responsible.
It might be a good thing for conservatives to start.
It is. Conservatives ought to do it, but they often don't, as we know.
Yeah. Well, they certainly have no. I'm flabbergasted by the lack of commitment to sound money, to use a Thatcher
Well, no one
term.
dares to commit to it in this country because it would be so difficult to do.
But this,
especially since the COVID panic, when we spent all that money shutting the country down.
That leads straight away to something I'd just be very interested in exploring your thoughts on. Much of what's happening in Western countries is common to them all. They're borrowing quite irresponsibly against their children and their grandchildren. It's a theme I often come back to because it worries me enormously. You've got a very rapidly declining birth rate. You've got young people disillusioned. They don't feel they can get a start in life. They can't afford a house. That's affecting family formation. Many of them don't want children anyway. What would you say about the state of, for want of a better term, the family?
I'm terrified by the whole thing, wherever I look. But it's particularly bad here. And for a long time, I've annoyed people by saying, look, the place is, I've never seen a country more finished. And part of the reason for this has been so many policies since the 1960s have been based on trying to replace the stable married family by the state in activities which it can't do. And this has entailed the weakening, particularly the weakening of the marriage bond to the point where it barely exists in reality anymore. And the weakening of family life in general, and almost the abolition of the two roles of husband and father, which were so important in my childhood, and which have now almost vanished from the life of many, many people. It scares me stiff. And on top of that, all the economic indicators flashing red, and you can't help worrying. This is why I don't really engage in politics, because I can't see any way in which anybody could conceivably come to political office in Britain now who could put forward an honest program which would confront these things. Because an honest program would be destroyed by the state of public opinion which we have now. That's another of the problems of modern politics. Honesty in politics is not rewarded.
Another way of putting that is that we seem to be in absolute denial of the evidence. I mean, we know, just to touch on something that you talked about, we know from all the research what children need early on. We understand the importance of stable homes. We actually understand it.
Yeah, we understand
it. It's all
well.
there.
Yeah.
And yet, they're almost things you can't talk about anymore. This
is correct.
Because
the new look, the Gramscian dogma of the New Left, although not Soviet, is still fundamentally hostile to the former Christian nature, particularly of the European nations, which are, and indeed the United States, which are at the heart of all this. It does oppose that. It isn't a supporter of marriage or the married family or many aspects of it, or indeed of tradition or parental authority or all kinds of other things which were essential in the old politics, now gone. It wants a new world. It remains utopian. It just has more subtle ways of achieving it than it used to have, and it can make it sound better than it ought to, and it does so. But the underlying problems still remain, and the deep core of the problems of this country and of the Western countries, going back, as I say, 60 or 70 years, are so profound that I just blench at the idea of trying to address them. If I was suddenly woken from a dream by a thunderous voice saying, "You're in charge now," I don't know if I'd dare to start. Almost everything you'd have to do would be so contrary to what people have been taught to believe.
You commented once that Trotskyism is one of the best political educations one can get.
I agree, yes. I agree
Well, you said that, so you agree.
Yes.
I was interested in that. Is this because it helps you understand how we got into this mess?
Very much so. It's a sort of modern Machiavellianism, of course. And an awful lot of Leninism, which is the close cousin to Trotskyism, is Machiavellianism. It is a total cynicism about politics, a willingness to place ends above means at all times, and to be completely ruthless. And that is a caricature of any form of politics, because in real politics, even in democratic law-governed countries, the people who are drawn towards it tend to be Machiavellian by instinct and are only restrained by law and custom, by their surroundings, but they're still at it. So it gives you an idea of how and why people behave, what their motives are, how far they're likely to be prepared to go under such circumstances. It also gives you historical appreciation. You understand particularly in continental Europe, why the current borders are where they are, why the nations have the current characters that they do, because so much of modern politics has its origins in the Russian Revolution and its aftermath.
So as a former
Trotskyist is the technical definition.
But here we've talked quite a bit about how people just do not seem to be able to sort of follow the evidence trail and so forth.
No.
You plainly did. You came to see the essential dishonesties and failings of that view of the world and changed. What drove that? What was it that helped you see so clearly that there was a better way?
Well, I'm not sure there is a better way. I just decided that was more and more of my decisions in life are on the basis of that was worse, I'll stop doing that, or that will be worse, I won't do it, rather than it will be better. I'm sorry about this rather limited, utterly non-utopian attitude, but it's what I have. I thought my abandonment of Trotskyism was for very simple reasons. The experience of life. I developed my revolutionary positions mainly as a student, living in a modern plate glass campus, completely secluded from normal life, except to the extent that if we engaged with people outside. I spent quite a lot of time, for instance, trying to proselytize among trade unionists, and so we did meet people who were not students, but they were people who agreed with us, or who thought that we had something useful to say, or thought that our politics were appealing to them. We didn't mix with the world as it really was. And then I went into this trade of journalism, and I left university. I went and lived in a small, fairly bleak industrial town in which I had to meet all the time the sort of people which Marxist revolutionaries despise. And I found them not to be despisable. I found them to be fully human and decent, and in almost all cases better than I was. And such direct personal experience that your ideology has misled you is rare in life, and I was given it. It's a great privilege. And so I was able over time to shake off what I had previously believed. It just wasn't tolerable anymore, either personally or philosophically. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to stop doing it.
You must have thought...
There was a lot of reading involved as well. I reread the other day. I hadn't read it for 30 years. Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon. This is a brilliant dissection of the Bolshevik mind by one of the great defectors from the revolutionary movement himself. And again, this enormously powerful belief, which is very hard to combat rationally, that the ends justify the means, which is at the heart of the whole of the book of Darkness. But of course, at the end of it, you still know that it's wrong. The ends do not justify the means. And that, however, that reason alone is simply not sufficient as a guide to life. You need something else. For that, you need to seek a different moral grounding. That took a lot longer to find.
There's a couple of questions that come out of that for me. The first one would be, I'm amazed at how business has given way to wokeism. With your sort of perspectives, you must have thought a bit about how non-material, non-ideological forces have contributed to the revolution that we've been talking about. So we now see moneyed interests, it seems, lobbying all parties.
Oh, yes. But
on issues like immigration, zero emissions, Brexit, the new rights agenda.
The war between money making and the left was a total mistake on both their parts. The left's attack on business and on what it termed capitalism is now, I think, acknowledged to have been a mistake. In China, where to get rich is glorious, is the perfect example of this. The Chinese state is perfectly happy to countenance very successful private business, provided they keep out of the business of the Chinese Communist Party. And modern left-wing governments in less autocratic countries have learned that it makes much more sense to regulate industry and commerce than to take it over. And commerce welcomes that. And then the other thing is, of course, that the social revolution, particularly the war on the idea that it was better for women to stay at home and raise children, has provided a vast new cheap workforce for business all over the world. Women are now, nobody anymore has to coerce them by economic or other pressure to go out to work. They're told that it's morally right to do so. And this has been a great plus for an awful lot of business, the vast increase in the available workforce that they've had. So these, to some extent, explain it. But I don't think, again, this is one of those tactical mistakes which the left made because they identified what they thought of as the forces reaction so totally with capitalist industry in the late 19th century, not realizing that actually their war was fundamentally and profoundly cultural. What we really go back to all the time, and what Marx, I think, was going back to when he became so enthusiastic about the Paris Commune in 1871, is that what Marx really was a man who wanted to take part in the French Revolution, particularly the bits after about 1792. The anti-Christian bits, the socially revolutionary bits. The economic stuff was added later and I think has now been taken away. We're back to the Jacobins. Who were much nastier than people think.
Yes, yeah. And the other thing is to draw out this loathing of Christianity that has been part of this whole revolution. You've touched on that.
Well, this is a key part of the French Revolution. Fouché's de-Christianization project, ruthless, the desecration of churches, the getting prostitutes to dance on the altars, the general mocking, derision and persecution of the Christian church was a key part of the French Revolution. Curiously little mentioned. Everybody knows about the guillotine. Very few people know about de-Christianization. But it was a vital part of it, and it's also one of the reasons why France still has this endless conflict between the church and the secular state, which never quite goes away.
I'd be interested in your views on what might be called the peaking of new atheism, and it's drifting off, and you're seeing quite a few significant figures saying we need to rethink there is a role for Christianity. You're actually seeing people who have converted to Christianity. New atheism seems to have been seen to be unable to offer, if you like, a new way for us to live. In a way, there was nothing new about new atheism anyway, it seems to me. But it became part of the popular rhetoric. Your brother was obviously part of it.
Yes.
Richard Dawkins was part of it. He seems to have moved in his own positioning. There are many other people who have been quite hard in their atheism who are moving away from it now.
Well, it wasn't based on any great new discoveries, was it?
No.
I was just very amused by the fact that the bookshops of Oxford some years ago used to be full of these books by Richard Dawkins denouncing these mad people who didn't believe in evolution. Piles and piles of books by Dawkins denouncing these people. You could search every shelf in every bookshop in the country. You couldn't find a single book by anybody actually denouncing evolution that he was supposedly replying to. It was all a bit one-sided. And then but I think it was really, the new atheist thing was really an American publishing phenomenon. And I think it may have been partly brought about by the association of Christianity, particularly with the George W. Bush administration and the Iraq War. But an awful lot of young Americans brought up in small towns by God-fearing parents, going to church, being taught to believe, Protestant, Catholic, whatever it might be, but as a general part of their lives, arriving at colleges where their entire lives negated everything that they'd been taught, all the things they expected to do in their private lives were entirely to do with bodily autonomy and absolutely nothing to do with Christian precept. And they found in the new atheists, particularly my late brother, who was brilliant at this, articulate, witty, coherent expression of what they wanted to do, which they could put in before their parents and say, yes, you did teach us this, and we did listen to the sermons, and we did go to church, but look, here is somebody as erudite and as fluent and as poetic and as knowledgeable as these people, and he says different. I think that was what it was about. But I think that America has passed through that now. I think the Christian religion is a lot weaker in America now than it was 20 years ago, particularly among the young. I think something definitely happened, but I think that particular thing is over. But I think the good thing from the point of view of Christians about the new atheist frenzy was that it actually made people more interested for a while in arguing about the Christian religion, which doesn't get much attention most of the time. And it was far preferable in the minds of many Christians to the indifference, which is much more common in this country, to religion. It's not a hostility. It's just, what is that? People don't know Bible stories.
No.
They don't know when Easter is or what it is. They're more familiar, I think, nowadays with the Norse and Greek myths because they come into the films a bit. They simply don't know what it is. It's not taught in the schools as a religion. If it's mentioned at all, it's generally as an anthropological peculiarity which other people might get involved in, but which the school student is not expected to get involved in himself. And it's this deadening indifference which is the real danger. People have no idea. They walk past a church. They don't go in. They don't go in, but the reason they don't go in is not because of a deep hostility, because they hate Christianity. They have absolutely no idea what goes on in there, and they're not interested.
There's a generational element to it too, I suspect. The younger you are, the less you know.
Yeah, but this has been certainly the fruit of the. Again, it hasn't really been legislated, but it's happened thanks to the Long March and the arrival in the institutions of people who weren't particularly interested in passing on Christianity. It's happened, and there it is. The de-Christianization of Britain didn't need the placing of prostitutes on altars or the deliberate desecration of churches or any kind of stamping out. It just came about through the creation of indifference.
You wrote an essay not long ago called The River of God, and you said that after decades as atheists, you and your wife felt, quote, an insatiable need for what I would now call the authority of God. Does it seem to you that others in the modern West may be looking for, if I can put it this way, some boundaries, some certainty, some...
Well, you never can tell, but I haven't seen much sign of it. And we had been through a particular series of experiences which were unique to us. And this is one of the things about trying to explain these decisions to other people. A lot of it is private, and I do believe very strongly in privacy of things which are and I can talk about myself within limits, but the limits are basically if it doesn't involve me talking about anybody else. But as I say, we had lived and continue to live a life very different from that of most people that we know, and so different pressures operated upon us from those that operate on other people, and that's the way it happened to us. But I think the problem is that if you wish to govern yourself, and I think the desire for self-government is not the same as the desire for bodily autonomy, in my view. Though they may present themselves to people quite similarly, I can quite see why people in their late teens and early 20s see autonomy as being so important. But in becoming a human being, and particularly the moment you have any power of decision over anything, you begin that might have long and important consequences. You begin to seek some sort of idea as to how on earth you could decide these questions and where the authority could come from, which enabled you yourself to exercise any authority. You know, fortunately, I exercise very little authority, but even when you do, and when it's very small, you do need somewhere to get it from. You need to know how to exercise it, and I think the discovery of the grave dangers of power without grace is one of the most significant discoveries that anybody can make.
I grieve deeply over the levels of anxiety, depression, self-harm, terms I've often used in these conversations, particularly amongst young people. It troubles me enormously. And that's why I've asked you those questions. Your journey is an important one. And we need to be able to talk more openly about these things. It's an interesting thing to me today that Jordan Peterson, on his own journeys, he's very open, he's very public about it, but he more than anybody else is at least allowing people to talk again about these
That things. Is true, but I'm not quite sure what beyond that one could say about it. And he plainly gives, I mean, you can't deny it, he gives some sort of comfort to an awful lot of his, I think it's reasonable to call them followers, but I'm not sure it's very coherent. I did read one of his books once. I found it, how shall I say, a complicated experience.
Well, I think the thing I'd say is that he's opened up the possibility for discussion. When someone of your standing makes themselves vulnerable and actually talks about why this is important and where you can find grace, and that it matters to go looking for it, I think we owe you a great debt for that.
I think I've been pretty careful not to give much away.
You've given enough away.
No.
The things that matter.
Heck. Oh well.
It's always great fun talking, Peter.
And to you.
I really appreciate it.